everyone. My name is Jhpiego, and I am the Strategic Planning and Operations Manager here at the World Trade Center Institute. And on behalf of WTCI, I'd like to welcome you to our first session of the AGILE 2021 Innovation Series. Before we begin our program, I would like to recognize several companies who make the AGILE series possible. Our visionary sponsor, Todd Rupert International, our university sponsor, Johns Hopkins Carey Business School, our platinum sponsors, RSM, Chase, and Lockheed Martin, as well as our gold sponsors, the Agora companies, Emergent Biosolutions, Cushman & Wakefield, Jhpiego, McCormick & Company, Tesco Technologies, Stanley Black & Decker, Communications Electronics, Prometric, Pompeian Olive Oil, and Ports America Chesapeake. So thank you all again for your continued support with this program. So we have a great session for you today with top experts who will discuss the important role of water and water scarcity on human health. And this is the first installment and part that will delve into various topics of protecting the world's water supply and what businesses and individuals can do to protect this valuable and increasingly scarce resource and why it's so important. So today you'll hear from three dynamic experts. We have Dr. Paul Ferraro, who is a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Human Behavior and Public Policy at the Whitting School of Engineering, Bloomberg School of Public Health, and Johns Hopkins Carey Business School, as well as Dr. Rajat Chhabba, who is a Senior Technical Advisor of Private Sector Engagement at Jhpiego. And of course, last but not least, Dr. Jude Cobbing, Senior Specialist of Water Infrastructure and Governance at Save the Children. The session today will be moderated by Bruce McIndoe, who is the founder of McIndoe Risk Advisory and a WTCI board member. And Bruce is a recognized leader, author, and speaker in the areas of risk management, technology, and intelligence. And as a founder of World Aware, which was recently acquired by GardaWorld, which is a leading provider of global intelligence, he has been the industry driver in creating and putting into practice the concept of integrated risk management, protecting people, sites, supply chain, and information assets for global organizations. And prior to founding World Aware in 1999, Bruce worked with a number of government agencies, including the NSA, the CIA, the Department of Defense, and NASA. And during this time, he developed systems for the intelligence community and space exploration. And he has also served as a lead architect on intelligence programs for the US government. So Bruce is passionate and knowledgeable on the subject of water. And at the end of the presentations today, he will lead the panel discussion and take live questions from the audience. So please welcome Bruce McIndoe, who will provide an overview of the session and topic. So Bruce.
Thanks, Jen, and welcome everyone and our panelists. And water is an incredibly important resource for us. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's so important, especially at the national security, but global as well issue. And of course, we know water is vital to life. And when you look at the planet from space and you say, wow, you know, this planet is well endowed with water. In fact, 2/3 of the Earth is covered with water. And so a lot of people don't really think about that we have water challenges, or they may periodically hear about water challenges, but say, you know, that really doesn't impact me. Well, the reality is that yes, we have all of this water, but when you look at what percentage of this water is actually, you know, drinkable or potable for humans, less than 1% of the water on the planet is actually accessible to us for drinking. And here's kind of the breakdown. And, you know, a lot of fresh water is frozen. Of course, climate change is changing that. And unfortunately, a lot of that frozen water is ending up in the oceans, making it brine or salty. So it's we're losing it as a resource for drinking. So this is the challenge. It is a very scarce resource, and it's getting scarcer. This is a map looking at basically withdrawals from our fixed supply globally, and kind of the projection in the next 20 years. And you can see from looking at the United States and many other developed countries that water is a increasingly scarce and becoming more scarce resource. And we're going to have and have had water stress issues in the United States that will continue. And we're going to be talking about that today from a number of angles, but also incentives to try to get this turned around. But I think also if you look at the top 10 cities that actually are moving and having water stress and water scarcity, and in the case of Cape Town, South Africa, where we actually have an operation, we were literally weeks, 2-3 weeks away from actually having zero water. So that is pretty scary. So who's consuming all of this water is also something that everyone should know. And the number one consumer of water globally is agriculture. And this ranges anywhere between 70 to 80%, depending on the measures. The bottom line, it is the vast consumer of water. And so this is why it's is and should be a major focus for figuring out how we manage and consume water here. On this municipal is where kind of people fit in, but as you can imagine, we're a small percentage of all municipal water consumption. So people from a survivability perspective is a very small percentage. So the reason that water becomes a geopolitical and national security issue is because it is an existential threat to humans. If you don't have water, 2-3 days, you are basically incapacitated or will die. That's a pretty ominous threat to humans. And then for a nation state becomes a national security issue. If someone could cut off your water supply to your citizens and your military, you're not going to last very long. The reason it's a geopolitical issue is water knows no nation state boundaries, and a lot of wars and conflict internally with countries, India is a good example, or among countries, and a brewing one right now is China's control over water in the Mekong River to Vietnam and Thailand and other areas. It creates tension and conflict when countries are sharing the same water sources. And of course, in order to grow crops and produce food, we've talked about how that drives the ability to generate agriculture and food. And if we don't have it, then people are going to move to find water. And so again, migration is not doesn't respect nation state boundaries either when people need food and water. So today we're going to discuss a range of these topics with our panelists. So we're going to talk about the impact on humans and human health. Dr. Jhpiego was going to talk about the private sector and what they can do and how they can help both the public sectors in partnerships. And then Dr. Ferraro, and excuse me, Dr. Ferraro, but this obviously didn't get your name spelled correctly, apologize, is going to talk about how to change people's behavior through incentives and looking at the economics of water. And then we're going to open a Q&A with the participants as well as the panelists. And I do want to put a plug that, we're going to continue this in a part 2 and looking at some of the broader issues around climate change and other larger scale issues around water in our part 2 in March. So with that, we're going to kick this off. And our first speaker is Dr. Jhpiego. As we said, he's a senior specialist at water infrastructure and governance at ProWash, which is part of the Save the Children in the US. He has over 20 years experience linking water resource evaluation and management to water sanitation and hygiene. So that's the WASH part of it, as well as energy, food security, climate, rural livelihoods, and environmental resilience. So, right in the middle of what we're talking about today. Jude's worked all over the world in Africa, Asia, North America, and Europe, and he's worked in both public, nonprofit, and private sectors. So he's going to kick us off, and over to you, Jude.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Thank you for that introduction, and welcome everybody. I'm really happy to be here and really excited to be here. I'm going to take you on a little journey today through the topic of water insecurity and global human health. As Bruce mentioned, I work for Save the Children US, and I'm a water sanitation and hygiene specialist. Here we go. First thing I want to address is, what do we mean by water insecurity? And quite simply, water insecurity means people who don't have access to a reliable supply of clean and continuously available drinking water. And at the moment in the world, that's about 2.1 billion people suffer from that condition. They don't have access to that clean drinking water. That's nearly 3 in every 10 people on the planet. And the first thing I'd like to say is that the main reason for this is not an absolute lack of water in the environment or on the planet, but rather a lack of the infrastructure, the systems, and the institutions needed to ensure these safe water supplies. And it's worth taking a moment to reflect on the fact that safe water supply is one of the biggest advances in global public health that we humans have ever made, and has helped to eradicate regular outbreaks of waterborne diseases. And it's worth remembering that, not much more than 100 years ago, big cities, including cities like Baltimore, Washington, DC, New York, used to experience fairly regular outbreaks of waterborne diseases such as typhoid and yellow fever and cholera. And they would kill hundreds, sometimes thousands of people every outbreak. And those of you who know Baltimore will know that the water infrastructure, piped water infrastructure, was first laid on in the early part of the 19th century. By the early part of the 20th century, Baltimore had chlorinated piped water, making it reliably safe to drink. And this kind of infrastructure takes regular maintenance and investment to keep it running. So the Ashburton water treatment plant in Baltimore was recently upgraded to the tune of some tens of millions of dollars. And but this is the infrastructure that keeps us all safe. And I'm going to come back in a minute to water sanitation and hygiene. But I just wanted to touch briefly on this topic of water scarcity first. And this question of, is water getting scarcer? And the amount of water on the planet stays roughly the same. We're not creating any more of it. But of course, as demand rises due to population growth and changing lifestyles, the constraint is getting tighter. As Bruce mentioned, agriculture uses about 2/3, sometimes more, depending on the country, of all the fresh water we extract, and we need that water to grow our food with. It's reckoned that about 13 gallons per person per day is the minimum amount of water that we need for personal needs. That's for washing, for cooking, for drinking. However, countries with less than about 260 gallons per person per day available, that includes the agricultural use, are labeled water scarce. Currently, about 3.6 billion people on the planet are potentially water scarce. And the worrying thing is that is predicted to increase to around 5 billion people water scarce by the year 2050. Back to water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. By sanitation, I mean essentially toilets or bathrooms. And roughly 2.3 billion people on the planet today lack access to basic sanitation services at home. In other words, they don't have a bathroom at home. And you can imagine that without an adequate water supply, it becomes very difficult to keep good sanitation and hygiene going in the home. By hygiene, I mean essentially hand washing. It's one of the biggest public health advances that we can make, simple hand washing, preventing the spread of disease. But in the world's least developed countries today, nearly 3/4 of people don't have basic hand washing facilities with simple soap and water in their homes. And this has a big impact on people. And about 1/3 of all childhood deaths across the planet are related to water, sanitation, and hygiene. In fact, it's the leading cause of child mortality and illness on the planet through illnesses such as diarrhea and malaria, simple treatable illnesses. A study in 2017 found that more than 140,000 children in sub-Saharan Africa died due to unsafe water. I'd like to talk a little bit about this issue of food and nutrition. So on the planet today, roughly 10% of people are not getting the calories that they need. They are in a chronic state of undernutrition. And roughly 25% of the people on the planet live with the fear of hunger or experience hunger from time to time. As Bruce mentioned, water is extremely important, obviously, to producing food. Of the planet's farmed land, cultivated land, about 20% is irrigated, but that 20% of irrigated land produces 40% of the world's food and 60% of the world's cereal crops. Now, to put those figures into a bit of perspective, today in sub-Saharan Africa, there are only 2 countries in sub-Saharan Africa that irrigate more than about 2.5 million acres. By contrast, the US state of Nebraska irrigates something like 7 million acres of land, and states like Texas and California are not far behind. And the issue of climate is one that is growing in seriousness as we go. Climate change means changes to water distribution, to water quality, and also to waterborne diseases such as malaria. And climate also means that conflict and population migration can become more serious, making water, food, and climate together what some experts are calling a complex problem with many facets, not easy to solve. Healthcare services, well, nearly half of all healthcare facilities in the world don't have regular piped water supplies, safe piped water supplies, which, as you can imagine, makes hygiene control, makes disease control, makes sanitation in those facilities that much more difficult, adds to the problems, the large problems that they already have. Lack of water also impacts on quality of education and health services and schools. About 1/3 of schools around the world don't have a reliable supply of water. And as you can imagine, this makes it more difficult to educate children, makes it more difficult for kids to go to school. And it particularly impacts on adolescent girls through their need to manage menstruation. So what is being done about this? Well, the good news is a lot. The United Nations, through its Sustainable Development Goals, has pledged to completely eliminate lack of access to safe drinking water and lack of access to sanitation and hygiene for all people by 2030. And underneath that umbrella, a huge amount is being done through partnerships and innovation, such as the innovative partnership, by the way, between my organization, Save the Children, and Procter & Gamble. We work on training, capacity building, innovation, and funding. The message that I'd like to leave you with today is that investments of only a few dollars per person per year can cover the costs of water and sanitation for all. Not only is this a winnable battle, it's a battle that we are winning and we expect to win. And I invite you all to join us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Cobb. Awesome. And so we're going to tee up the next speaker, who's Dr. Jhpiego. As we said, he's the Senior Technical Advisor for Private Sector Engagement at Jhpiego. Jhpiego is an international not-for-profit that works across public health issues in marginalized and low-resource countries. And he leads the strategic engagement with private health ecosystems and drives developmental action globally. So he has a tremendous amount of experience in this area, and we're going to learn from him about how the private sector can make a big difference in this. So take it away, Rajat.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. And thanks, Jude, for setting up the context. I think it is critical for us to understand that why there is a need for private sector to come into this space. Private sector plays an important role in enabling, accelerating, financing, and scaling up water resource management through investments in service delivery, as well as in water supply and sanitation and irrigation. I think it is also important for us to understand how undervalued the water is, and also how we are making it more of a commodity than a price product over the past few decades. So today I would like to share about how private sector has been contributing in this space with few key examples uh, in certain areas. In terms of looking at innovations, we believe there is, as water is getting scarcer and scarcer, we need to look at new ways of generating water. I would take the opportunity today to talk about how we can generate water and some examples from air, snow, and fog. As Jude was talking about, it's a big challenge in rural areas, in LMIC context, in low and middle income countries. We'll talk about and see examples of how low cost drinking water solutions at the community level can actually create an impact. And finally, talking about, considering it's a big infrastructure sector, how urban infrastructure is being influenced from two perspectives, both from the large public-private partnerships that can happen in this space, and second, in terms of how the upcoming newer technologies can actually help build greater efficiencies in the system. So we look at water harvesting. I would like to give an example of an organization called WaterGen. It's developed a unique and advanced technology to extract water directly from air using a patented technology called Genius, which enables to generate water at almost 300 watts hour per liter. Initially designed to actually support militaries in Israel, US, and France, this technology is now being used a lot for humanitarian context to provide water access in constrained settings. The guiding principle is that it is easier to purify water than air. The system thrives a lot in hot and humid conditions. And with 1 liter of water costing 7 to 15 cents, it is extremely cost effective as well. The organization has been able to generate this into 3 different models, and that has allowed them to actually address both institutional and individual needs. The company devices, the key advantages of this model is that it's easy to set up and establish. It is 4 to 5 more efficient than water in terms of in generating water compared to the humidifiers, and consumes 80% less energy. So it's a model that has been growing steadily and is delivered by a US-based organization itself. Looking at the community-based solutions in drinking water, these are solutions which are driven in a bottoms-up approach and provide an opportunity for sustainability as well. A lot of organizations take water, private sector organizations engage in corporate social responsibility, and Piramal also started in a similar manner by creating low-cost drinking water solutions. However, over a period of time since their inception in 2008, they have graduated into a social enterprise because it is highly sustainable for them to provide water, and they have been working steadily to create a network of micro entrepreneurs. As part of their solution, Piramal Sarvajal, as it is called, it actually installs water ATMs. More than 600 solar-powered, cloud-connected, smart card-built water ATMs have been installed in different parts of rural India, which create a pay-per-use model for the community. They've also involved various community institutions to actually be a partner in this, creating a kind of a community-based public-private partnership and establishing a network of micro entrepreneurs in the community. They have reached to over 6 million people over the past few years and have more than 1,500 touch points in 20 states. The newer advancements of technologies also involve them to control the drinking water solutions remotely, monitor the quality, and they continue to provide technical and maintenance support to these entrepreneurs. The second example that we can look at is actually from Water Health International, set up as an installation to advanced engineering technologies. and utilizing off-the-shelf solutions such as UV light disinfection and multi-stage filtration. Apart from the water treatment plant, the center also creates an opportunity and space for people to come together and the community to engage with each other. They've established it as a public-private partnership with the urban local bodies and municipal corporations, and they look at it from a 3 different model perspective. In the first model, it is about the capital expenditure which is actually being provided by the private donor, and also the community contributes. So there is an investor who also comes in to actually support the installation. In the second model, it is more like a build, operate, transfer model where the private sector invests the capex cost and the community comes in and takes it after a period of time. In the third model, it is often a part ownership that takes into place. Currently, they are operating in India, Nigeria, and Ghana. It has proven to be highly successful, and the quality of water is highly appreciated by the communities as well, in which they are supported. The capex cost and the investment in this is around $30,000 to $40,000 upfront, with an operating cost of $300 to $400 on a monthly basis. However, with the catchment area being well defined, the entrepreneur is able to recover the cost in an efficient manner. The next example that we can look at is actually around how we can make the urban water infrastructure more efficient. Jude spoke about how the leakages and piping has actually been a problem as well, especially in various health and non-health settings. So Faclon Labs, a Mumbai-based organization, has actually established a sensor-based system which allows you to actually remotely, using your mobile device, manage and control the efficiency of these piping infrastructure. They've created a sensing device called IOSense or AquaSmart, which provides real-time data, consumes very low power, and communicates securely and allows for remote control of pump and valves. It provides a 360-degree view of the water management system by measuring water level, flow, and other relevant parameters. It has demonstrated a huge potential in terms of impact. For educational and corporate campuses, it has resulted in savings of more than 7,500 liters of water per day. For municipal deployments, almost 25% of savings have been demonstrated, which is almost equivalent to 9 million liters in certain contexts. Apart from that, there are savings in pumping and electricity costs as well that come with it. All these 4 models are good examples of how the private sector is actually engaging in a public sector dominated system. However, there are certain critical success factors that we need to keep in mind, and we can learn from some of these as we move forward. First and foremost, there needs to be a strong political will. The government needs to contribute, align the policies, and make sure that there is incentives or alignments with the requirements of the private sector as well. Second, there needs to be a good contracting mechanisms and transparency in the systems that we do. And there is a clear role and responsibility for both partners. Public-private partnerships provide that opportunity through different models of leasing, concession, build, operate, transfer, and design, where both the public and private sector can work together over a long-term basis. Especially when we are looking at large infrastructure projects in wash, sewage, fecal sludge management, they sometimes run over a period of 20 to 25 years. So building in the transparency, clear role is extremely critical. And as we move forward, technology will be integral part of all the future PPPs in water management. Thank you so much. Over to you, Bruce.
Thank you. And we will, whoa. Sorry, for some reason, my screen just went blank. Good old technology. Anyway, so our next speaker is Dr. Paul Ferrero. He has dual appointments at Johns Hopkins and the Whiting School of Engineering, as well as the Carey Business School, where he's the Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Human Behavior and Public Policy. His research focuses on building credible evidence base about environmental and social impacts of public and private programs. So Dr. Ferraro is going to show us how we need to start thinking about water as a managed commodity and using incentives and economics to drive a solution. So I'll turn it over to you, Paul.
Great, thanks, Bruce. Great to be on this panel. So I want to focus on those bright red countries in Bruce's map. If you remember that global map of water stress in 2040, those are the places I wanted to focus on most particularly. And in my 10 minutes, I just want to focus on one simple but extremely important idea that I label the fundamental law of water use. And it's simple: underpriced water and people are going to overuse it. And although it seems obvious, when you look at how we manage water, this fundamental law seems to be ignored. And this is not unique to water. This is the problem underlying most environmental issues, that when people choose to turn on their lights, use water, exploit land, they don't take into the full costs of that decision. So they ignore those costs, and we leave all these overuse of clean air, overuse of ecosystems and biological diversity. And we have the same problems when we try to deal with traffic congestion. And what are the typical solutions? Build more roads, more lanes on the highway, make road designs more efficient, traffic light timing more efficient. Right? But those changes are temporary fixes. And congestion always returns because the solutions don't address the fundamental problem that road space is scarce and drivers ignore the full cost of their decisions to use that space. And it's the same situation in water, right? Where when people use water, they are not seeing the full cost of that use, and so they ignore those costs. So the cost of water doesn't reflect its true scarcity, and we tend to overuse it as a result. And we tend to try to solve the problem just like traffic engineers do. We try to do it through technology. We build reservoirs. Right? We try to change the way we do industrial processes or agriculture to make it more efficient in how we use water. Right? But that doesn't change the fundamental problem that the costs are not being recognized by the users. And until we change that, we're not going to see solutions to the water scarcity problem. And nowhere is this more clear than the case of agriculture. As Bruce pointed out, agriculture consumes vast majority of fresh water out there that humans use. In the US, it's about 80% of consumptive withdrawals, and that's the same throughout the whole world. By consumptive, I mean when we take out water and it makes it unavailable for others to use, at least on an economically relevant time scale. Right? So energy for energy generation and cooling uses a lot of water, but that goes back into the system. But people can use it. What we care about is this consumptive use. And farmers generally only pay for the cost of pumping water and distributing it. And even in those cases, they don't often pay the full cost, often subsidized by government. So when they use water, they don't take into the full costs of using it, that when they use it, it's not available for other uses that may be more important socially for the country or the world. And they tend to overuse water. And our solutions tend to be through innovations, right? We're going to do genetic engineering of crops so they don't need as much water. We're going to create irrigation technology that can deliver water more efficiently so farmers don't need as much water. This picture here you see is drop nozzle irrigation. It brings the irrigation closer to the plant so that it's more efficient. Agricultural engineers have tested this technology on farms where they do exactly the same type of cropping and practices, and they randomize it across different soil types. And they show that when you use this technology rather than the old technology, you reduce water by 15 to 30%, depending on conditions. But the problem with that idea is that people adopt it, and then we get this reduction, is it assumes that people don't change everything about how they behave once they adopt technology. Very infrequently do communities, people, businesses adopt technology and keep everything the same in how they behave. And there was a great study of the effect of this kind of irrigation technology in the Great Plains of the United States, where we have the Ogallala Aquifer. It's one of the largest groundwater systems in the world. It's underneath 7 states. It's a shallow aquifer. Agriculture is the big user, and they're pumping it, the water out much faster than it can be replenished. And so the idea was the government came in and subsidized farmers to take up this technology, and the hope was that it would reduce water use by about 20 to 25% based on engineering estimates. An economist got data on water use of farmers long before the technology came in, and then was able to watch as farmers started adopting this technology over time, and was able to use that data to isolate the effect of this new innovative technology on water use. And what she found was that water use didn't go down by 20, 25%, it went up. And what she found was that farmers, once they adopted this technology, expanded their area under irrigation and changed their crop mix to more water demanding crops. And the problem is that it didn't address the fundamental problem that the costs are not fully embedded in the price that farmers face when they use water. It didn't address the basic incentive problem. So innovations are absolutely essential, but they can't lead. Right? They need to follow policy solutions. Right? And let me just give you one example of a policy solution. It's not a full solution. It's not the only solution that would achieve the same goals. It's a solution that I'm stealing from the context of fisheries, where it's the same problem. When fishers take out fish out of the ocean, they're not taking to the full account of the cost of doing that. Right? The fact that once they take it out, it's not available for any other person to use. And you get the same sort of incentive where people are pumping, they're taking out those fish, and we're over exploiting those fisheries. Right? So in fisheries, it's called catch shares. I'm calling it here water shares, but it's the same idea that we have a group, scientists, politicians, citizens that set the amount of water that can be withdrawn from a watershed. And that's based on scientific, economic, and justice criteria. They allocate shares, and that's a political process, right? It's not that easy, but it's being done in other contexts. You can reserve some portion for basic needs, right? So that we make sure that poor people aren't being priced out of basic needs for water. Those shares are allocated, and then we let people use their shares, trade them, or don't use them, right? So conservationists, if they want to have more water for flow for species, can also just not use them. That's the other perverse thing that we have in many contexts, including agriculture, is we have these use it or lose it policy regulations, where if a farmer doesn't pump the water and show that they're irrigating crops, they can lose their right to that water, and therefore they have an incentive just to keep pumping, even if it's not economically valuable for the crops. So the idea is that we're going to use markets for what they're good at, pricing scarce resources and allocating them among their highest uses. We make sure that we're only taking out the amount of water that can be sustainably taken out of this system, and we allow people flexibility across economic sectors, across the private and public sectors, to be able to use this water. And then the innovations will follow. Right? This will set a price for water. People will take into account, if I'm pumping water out right now, that's less for others to use, it's less for people in the future to use, and you're going to get innovations, right? But innovations are following in this case, they're not leading. Right? So what we're focusing on here is addressing the fundamental problem that people, particularly in middle and high income nations, are not seeing the full cost of their actions, and we're forcing them to see those full costs and change their behavior accordingly. I'm going to end with that, we can get back on time. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ferraro, and thanks all the panelists for kind of setting up the context of the challenges that we have, not only with water, but using it and sharing it. And so I'm going to open up the Q&A. So this is your opportunity to interact with the panelists. So if you have questions, and I hope you will, if you just click on the Q&A button, you can put your question in and we can talk about them. So I'm going to add myself into the group here, and I'm going to start with actually Dr. Ferraro, since you were just talking about putting price on water. And I think the obvious question is, if we put price on it, does that exacerbate the challenges of income inequality between the haves and the have-nots? So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I hope the audience sees the tension in Jude's presentation and my presentation, because that's a fundamental tension, a lot of environmental issues that we want to solve these problems without exacerbating injustice. And I have two quick responses. The first is that because these basic needs are not a huge footprint, we can solve those. We can do two-tier systems where there's very cheap water for basic needs, and then there's more expensive water for industrial, agricultural, and other things like watering lawns or pools or things like that. That's one way. And the other response I would make is that we shouldn't try to solve inequality by making water artificially cheap for everybody. That just transfers the problem from inequality to the overuse of water that will end up exacerbating that problem in the future. So I think we need to address inequality, which is the unequal distribution of the means to be able to access resources without artificially making water cheap for everybody. But I agree that's a fundamental tension and where a lot of the obstacles lie.
Okay, let's see. Maybe Jude, you can take this one. If we're going to run out of water in 20 years, which is not what that says, but is it inevitable? And if policy moves so quickly, are we just going to hit a brick wall?
Thanks, Bruce, and thanks, Paul. It's a tricky one, this whole water scarcity issue, because in aggregate, we can show that water is getting scarcer in many regions. Paul's absolutely right. It's too cheap in many areas. But for the world's poorest, surprisingly enough, they tend to pay far more for water than people do in developed countries. So you get folks who have to pay water carriers in some of the big urban centers of the developing world at prices far in excess of what I would pay, say, in Washington, D.C. So we have the opposite problem there, where people are paying too much. And we lack the systems, we lack the infrastructure, and we lack the institutions to ensure that there is a suitable supply available. This issue of agriculture using more water than using too much water because it's underpriced, that absolutely does apply, although that doesn't always help people who lack a basic water supply, because it's one thing to save water in an agricultural area. It's quite another to make sure that it gets in a safe way to places where it's needed. Thank you.
So yeah, so it's so I guess I would summarize that it's not inevitable that we hit a brick wall, but we need to be working on it every single day, right? So and that's interesting, Dr. Chaba. A couple of things have come up on the private public partnership side. One of them is, you talked about the next gen water system that pulls water from, essentially harvests water from humidity and that. One of the questions here is, how easily is that deployable and movable?
So thanks for the question, Bruce. It comes in 3 different variants. It's for an individual use, for a home use, and for industrial use. Depending on the capacity that we're looking at and the volumes that we need to generate, the size, the 3 models are available. The smaller models are easily deployable and movable, the individual and the home-based use models. However, the industrial models take a bit of time. They're mostly stationary in nature and fixed in nature. However, having said that, as I was saying, air is one way of creating water. The other ways are actually through fog and snow as well. There are models in hilly areas where snow or where there are glaciers, fog is being used to actually create water also. So as these are new advancements which are coming in, but are highly promising as well.
Okay. And I guess there's another one here as well, talking about the ATMs, the water vending machines, and just thinking about if you're deploying these, does it depend on single-use plastic containers and as well as energy consumption and those kinds of things? Are we creating other challenges by deploying large numbers of these? So
yeah,
maybe you can address that.
Great point. I think the way I have seen that the market has evolved. It started with some of those challenges where they were consuming a lot of electricity, generating a lot of plastic waste, but now they have evolved. The water ATMs that we presented are currently based on solar power. So there are models where they are using economical ways in terms of of energy consumption, and also in terms of utilization. There are models in terms of how water is being supplied and distributed. So these fixed structures are now being supplemented through an operating model which is far more efficient. So there are doorstep delivery options which are available. The customer can use for pay-for-use models. Smart ATM cards, just like we use for our trains, are actually being created for these as well, where people can track their consumption also. And
Okay.
yeah.
Good. Okay. Yeah, Dr. Ferraro, you're getting some whole series of questions here. I'm going to try to summarize them. Obviously, you start putting a price on water, you get a lot of attention. Let's see. So how can we increase individual understanding sensitivity to the actual cost of water as it relates to agriculture? Are there certain foods, behaviors that we could change to that would significantly reduce the use of water by eating less meat or different types of, you talked about high water consumption crops. So I'll let you address that one.
Yeah, so, I mean, in principle, changing the demand could change the way the people do supply. But the way that agriculture works and what we're producing things for, that would be a very hard path to take. I'm not saying that people shouldn't change their diets to match their ideals, but as a solution, where we just let farmers continue to pump at low prices and then try to change our diets, that would be a very difficult path to achieve for a solution. If you want to do something about raising awareness, it's really, I think people could spend their time trying to get a change in how we treat farmers. We don't price how they use water. We don't price when they put fertilizers down, they run off into our waterways and pollute. There's this sort of political barrier preventing the same kind of pricing that we see in lots of other contexts and regulations where we don't do that in agriculture. And that's throughout the world. Europe still has the same problem, as well as middle countries. So that would be where I would spend my time, is trying to advocate for a policy solution rather than depending on individual voluntary change.
Yeah, and in the part 2 in March, we're going to talk about how systems interconnect. So if you take, for example, livestock, which is a major consumer of water, but also food in order to create the protein. And it also is the #1 contributor for greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. You know, reducing consumption of meat does actually solve or impact multiple issues. So we'll talk more about that in March. But the other one, just to finish this up, Paul, is really a 2-part thing, and one you may or may not know the answer to, but the other one you will. So one is, you know, will genetic engineering in agriculture help reduce the amount of water that's needed for agriculture? And then the other part of the equation is, if we increase the price of water on agriculture, are we going to drive ourselves into food scarcity because farmers, you know, aren't going to produce as much because it costs too much? So kind of can we solve it through genetics? And what happens if we start putting this cost on farmers? Are we going to produce less food?
Yeah. So the first question, genetic engineering has solved it? No, not. It's going to be the same temporary fix that we have now. That if you can actually, because we don't have we're not we have excess demand for food. Right? People will consume more and different varieties of food. So if farmers can find ways to deliver water more cheaply to crops, they'll innovate in ways that deliver more crops, just like we saw in that Kansas example. So it's very unlikely, except in maybe localized places, that genetic engineering would be more than a temporary fix. It's a great innovation to deal with your second question, that as the water price goes up, we're going to produce less food. That might be problematic, but then you'll see innovations like genetic engineering that will bring those costs down and allow people to continue to produce food without using as much water. But until that price reflects its true value, you won't see that change in water use.
Okay, great. And Dr. Cobbing, if you come off mute. Your quote about that we have, we're going to potentially have 4 to 5 billion people facing water scarcity by 2050, which obviously the 2040 map was showing that where those people likely will be. So, how are we on track to kind of deal with this? And, can you expand on what's driving the 2050 growth of water challenges? Is it population? Is it lack of action? That's a big, you're putting a big problem out there. Why don't you give it a little bit more context?
Yeah, sure, Bruce, thank you. And the first thing to know is we have roughly the same amount of water on the planet. It's not getting any less or any more, but populations are growing, and more importantly, lifestyles are changing. And as people get richer, they use more water, either directly or through the food that they eat as diets change. And these are the main drivers of it. It sounds like a very serious thing. It is a very serious thing, but what I'd remind you is that don't forget water scarcity. The definition is of having a lower amount than about 260 gallons per person per day. And for basic human needs, we only need 13 or 20 gallons per day. So this doesn't mean that we're all about to run out of water and not have anything to drink or not have anything in our homes. This is exactly as Paul was saying, this is an allocation issue. It's about policy. It's about partnerships between government and the private sector, and it's about figuring our way out of this. There are very few places in the world where absolute shortage of environmental water means that basic human needs are difficult to supply. We've got the water for basic human needs. What we need are the institutions, we need the commitment, we need the funding to make sure that that happens.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then just on the tail of that, because why can't we drill more wells? So maybe you can just answer that quickly about this being, fixed.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the short answer is we can drill more wells. And in many places, we can drill more wells, groundwater conditions permitting. The problem with that often is that the easy part is drilling the well and putting in a pump. The hard part is making sure that that well and that pump stay working, stay maintained, stay operating for long enough to supply everybody who needs water. And that requires a surprisingly complicated number of a mixture of institutions and organizations and funding inputs to sustain a source. So often our response to a water shortage is to say, well, we need another water source. Let's identify that, whether it's a well or a new intake from a river or a desalination plant. Surprising as it sounds, that's the easy part. The hard part is, how do we keep that source producing? How do we keep it sustainable, not only environmentally, but financially and institutionally? Those are the difficult things.
So I'm going to do a round robin here on this question, because I think we have a lot of people that represent companies one way or the other on this. And this is, my company works with food manufacturers, chemical, cosmetic companies. Do you think the government will create initiatives to have incentives, I guess, to have them consume or have better use of water? And would manufacturers have to maintain a level of cleanliness of water that they waste? So why don't we talk about that? I'm going to start with you, Jude, and then I'll go to Rajat and then Paul.
Yeah, I'm really glad you raised the issue of water quality, Bruce. We haven't touched on it much, but it's a huge thing. It's one thing to have, it's not enough to have a water supply. If the quality is poor, then we might as well not have it at all. Or we have to spend a lot of money on treatment. And in some cases, that treatment can cost more than the benefit that it brings. And there are huge potential for innovations, absolutely, in protecting water quality. It's much easier to protect water quality than it is to treat it once it's polluted. And that's particularly the case with groundwater. So, you know, water quality is a dimension of water that a lot of people miss, but if anything, it's just as important as the quantity of water.
So Rajat?
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. Building on what Jude said, I think it's a responsibility not only for the government to actually create those policies, but also for the private sector to be more responsible towards their customers as well. I think the more we focus on the quality of water along with the quantity and the usage of it, proper usage of it, it also brings in economic value for their products and services as well. I think that acknowledgement need to happen, and that it needs to work in tandem for both the organizations put together, both the sides.
Yeah. Dr. Farrar, why don't you talk a little bit about looking at this issue of consumption by industry from an economics perspective.
Right. So there's two parts of that. There was the consumption side and then the quality side. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Side,
in and out. Right?
Yeah. So the out we've actually done in places where the rule of law is reasonably strong in middle and high income countries. We've done a decent job of addressing those point sources, those pipes that are coming off of manufacturing and pollution. On the consumption side, I don't know what they meant by incentives, but if we mean giving financial incentives to adopt new technologies or technical assistance, that won't solve the problem. That would be the equivalent of subsidizing farmers to adopt more irrigation efficient technologies to see water use not change or increase. Again, it has to be, this is part of the problem. Why would private industry want the price of water to go up? It's for those that are most efficient users who think they can be efficient users, they'll give you a competitive advantage over your competitors. Like that's where you would want to see the government institute rules that would maybe raise the cost, but give you an advantage in that competitive sphere. But simple incentives like subsidies won't solve the problem because there's always more demand for your product to expand or change the product mix and claw back some of those gains from the new technologies or changes in production processes.
Okay. Here's an interesting one just about, our human consumption of water, primarily in developed countries, but, we talked about sanitation. So right now, most municipal systems deploy potable water for sanitation, i.e. toilets, and for gardening. So what do you think about the impact that has, and does it make sense to change those distribution technologies to not be wasting potable water? So Jude, I'm going to start with you, and we'll see what everyone's opinions are about how we use water.
Sure, Bruce. I mean, it sounds crazy, doesn't it, to use potable water for your bathroom and for watering your garden, but in many cases, the reality is that it's easier to treat it all to a potable standard and to put it through one set of pipes and one reticulation system to homes. As long as the environmental water is not very badly contaminated, basic water treatment is not that difficult. Again, the difficulty is maintaining it and paying for it, but the basic process is not that hard to turn it from river water or lake water into potable water. And to the best of my knowledge, it's the dangers inherent in having a two-pipe system. So in other words, pipes, a clean water source for drinking and a not clean source for bathroom use or for garden watering, outweigh the cost and danger of that outweighs the advantage of it.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to bring in an example, and then we'll let Rajat and Paul weigh in on this. Until there's a price, it's very difficult to make trade-off decisions, right? So I have had an electric feed from the local power company to my house. I put in a solar generation system and became a power generation plant on their network to reduce my cost that I'm paying them to get electricity. But I had to pay for that solar system. But in doing a calculation, in 5 years, I was making money. And I had a 15-year warranty. So I had essentially, 10 years of no cost of ownership, right? So that was a clear economic decision. Well, the same thing with my garden. I have a catch basin for rain to water the garden out of just general, attitude. There was no calculation of how much water am I spending on gardens, right? So Rajat, talk a little bit about what you think about these kinds of systems from a private-public partnership, and then Paul will talk about the incentives on the other end of that, about how
So
people
Bruce,
consume. Go ahead.
Yeah. So Bruce, I think you made a very valid point in terms of how the mechanics should work. The incentives should cross subsidize, and I think we need to identify where to tax and where to actually subsidize it. Right? I think we need to incentivize for the use or purification of water and conservation on the use of potable water. Right? And that can happen in multiple ways. I think at an institutional level, we see the innovative financing tools and mechanisms coming in, which are incentivizing through public-private partnerships, different concessions in terms of how corporates can play a bigger role in this. And at an individual level, the pay for performance model or the micro entrepreneurial models are actually creating those incentives at the community level. But I think there is a long way for us to move in that direction, because we need to look at water from a value for money perspective and not only from a pay for service perspective.
Okay, and Paul, for one final remark from you, and then I'm getting the hook.
Just a quick, I just wanted to say just the same point that innovations are important, but they shouldn't lead. So purple pipes and reuse, and those are interesting ideas, and they may be the most efficient, but they won't solve the problem if they're leading it rather than following.
Great, thank you all, and back to you, Jen.
Yes, thank you all so much. That was such a great informative session. And thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. And with that, also like to thank our sponsors once again for being able to provide this content to you all and making it possible for this series to happen. Thank you to our university sponsor, Carey Business School. At Carey, they shape business leaders who seize opportunity, inspire change, and create lasting value. And with full-time, part-time, and online MBA and MS degrees in Baltimore and Washington, D.C., these degrees are built to really compete in the global marketplace. And as you can see with Paul's presentation or Dr. Ferraro's presentation and work, Carey's faculty are thought leaders that are trailblazing what's next in the business world and in the classroom. So as Bruce mentioned, next up in our Agile series on March 10th, we have a part 2 session of innovations in protecting the world's water supply, focusing on water and the environment, which will focus more on that agricultural component. We'll have great speakers for that session as well. And thank you all so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed today's session, and a recording of the session will be sent out within the next couple of days. And we look forward to hosting you again at the next Agile session on March 10th. Be well, everyone, and stay safe.